everyone! Welcome to my raid tanking guide. As you know, I strongly believe in druid tanking, and in most scenarios it is optimal to have one of your healers be your tank. But with a bit of skill and some small build adjustments, anyone can do it. So this guide isn't aimed at any specific class, and I also won't be explaining the exact pattern of where and when to move every boss, because you can find that in any existing boss guide. What I'm going to explain is the general principles you can apply to any boss. First of all, what's the job of the tank? Here's a few simple rules to remember. Rule 1. Do not move the boss. A good tank is a tank that thinks about their squad. You want to tank in a way that allows your DPS players to DPS freely. Not because they are self-centered monkeys that care only about their numbers on Arc, but because it is literally their job as DPS to deal as much damage as they can, and it is your job as a support to help them achieve that. Moving the boss for no reason is what makes everyone lose their minds, because everything about moving is a DPS loss. If a build relies on taking AoE fields, you will be moving the boss out of those AoEs and they will cry. If a build relies on Torment, well, Torment deals less damage to moving enemies, so they will cry. If they have any skills they need to stand still for, you will be moving the boss out of their melee range and they will cry. So please, make your squad happy and keep the boss perfectly still. On a lot of bosses, Deimos being one example, this is as simple as just positioning yourself exactly at the spot where the boss spawns and not moving from there. However, Zira might be a little tricky in this regard, as gliding into the platform too late will result in her walking out of the middle, while gliding too early can get you stuck inside the platform if your timing and positioning are unfortunate. So here's a little trick. You can start gliding early, and then, as scary as it sounds, just close your glider and fall. As long as you don't do it super early, you will be ported back onto the platform exactly in the middle, perfectly into the first tanking spot. Rule 2. Do not turn the boss to the group. This rule should be pretty self-explanatory. You don't want other players to take any damage it's possible to avoid, because the healers that need to heal more, the DPS players lose their scholar uptime, and in the worst case everyone will start dying. Furthermore, some DPS builds need to flank, so they need to stay behind the boss. Here you can see some examples of power builds and their flanking traits, as well as some examples of power builds that run 5th runes, which also force you to flank. If you have someone playing one of these in your squad, you might need to pay extra attention to positioning the boss in such a way that there is enough space behind it. There is also one exception to this rule: Cardinal Sabir. On this boss specifically, getting hit by the boss attacks grants you an outgoing damage buff, so it is ideal for everyone to stand in front. Keep in mind, however, that it's at the same time an incoming damage debuff, meaning that the healers will need to work extra hard to keep everyone alive. Rule 3. Move the boss when necessary. And I cannot stress this enough. When necessary. No, you being one step away from what you learned as the tanking spot is not a valid reason to move the boss. Any boss movement should be predictable and calculated, not random and erratic. You should move when it makes sense to move, because then your DPS players will expect the movement and adjust their rotation. For example, spawning their AoEs where the boss is about to be moved to, or delaying the skills they need to stand still for until after the boss is moved. Expecting the movement will also allow them to move together with you and the boss. If they are melee and you move unexpectedly, they will lag behind and spend some time not hitting the boss at all, which is again a DPS loss. Let's look at some examples. On Mursad Overseer, I see tanks often moving the boss out to this spot. Originally, when Epidemic was a very strong skill, it made sense to move here in less experienced groups, so that Epidemic could hit 3 statues to ensure they get cleaved. However, nowadays, I see people moving here even with no scourges in the squad. Now that Virtuoso exists, it's better to stay in the middle so that they can cleave all 4 statues. Furthermore, in CM, it's actually insanely important to stay in the middle, not here, because of the blue mechanic. If everyone has to spread out to their blue tiles and the boss isn't in the middle, as you can see, melee classes cannot even hit it. On Deimos, you should keep the boss where it spawns until the oils start spawning, so until 60%. But because your squad takes a green at 75%, this gives you a great opportunity to move the boss out of the middle while they aren't there. You can reposition without worry, and when the squad comes back, they will find the boss and move there. In fact, every green taken by the squad gives you an opportunity to reposition freely. What you need to keep in mind is that you shouldn't move too far out to the edge, because then people will need to run back and forth between the boss and the shield in the middle. Ideally, you want to keep it close enough to the middle such that the oils don't cover the shield area, while at the same time the boss remains in melee range for everyone during Mind Crash. When you're walking the boss out of an oil, don't take it on a walk across the entire arena either. Move it only as much as is necessary for people to melee and to flank without walking into an oil. So what defines necessary movement? Here's the only 3 reasons you would ever move a boss for. The squad is in immediate danger if they stay in melee range. That would be spikes on a Maw, an incoming wall on a Sage, Zira standing inside the laser, etc. The squad is unable to melee, unable to flank, or certain classes do not have enough space to do their rotation. Like explained earlier, that would be Deimos standing inside an oil, Canute inside a tornado, or less obvious stuff, like Mirages unable to use Axe Free, which ports them to a random location around the boss, because you're keeping SH literally right next to a Golem AoE. Mechanical reasons that might result in a wipe. Examples would be moving KC to a glowing statue to cleave it, moving Deimos to split soul or prides in CM if you have no immob or long range cleave, or moving Doom towards the greens you're taking as the tank. Keep in mind that some of these examples don't require movement depending on your strategy, and it's good to communicate with your squad to see what they expect of you and vice versa. If you've tried tanking before, you might have noticed one issue with doing the predictable and calculated movement that I've mentioned. Sometimes you'll attempt to move Soulless Horror just a step, but she literally will not move. Sometimes Casey will randomly stop, do an auto attack, and then move another step. No, don't move him out of my whirling axe! These situations happen because of high melee range of bosses and their memory of where you were where you queued the skill. If you're trying to move a boss just a tiny step, it often won't be possible because the spot you're trying to move it to is still within their melee range, so they will simply keep attacking you instead of moving. In such situations, you will need to run a little further and walk forwards as soon as the boss starts moving. As for the random stopping and doing an auto attack before walking one more step, in most situations, it's better to accept that the boss stopped and walk forward to keep it there, rather than try to move it another step. If we look at KC as the example, you're moving it out of the middle towards a wall, but in a moment, you will be moving it again anyway to one of the glowing statues. So if the boss randomly decides to stop during the initial movement, just keep it there, since you will be repositioning it in a moment anyway, so it doesn't matter where exactly you keep it at the start. Rule 4. Hack the boss hitbox. This goes for both the tank from the front and the group from the back. The bigger the hitbox, the more important this rule is. You can see in this Deimos example that I'm casting Rejuvenating Tides while tanking, and the group is barely in range of it. If you're playing support, you want to be sitting inside the hitbox and have your squad hug the boss from behind so that they are in range of your heals and boons. If you're tanking as DPS, the rule still applies because you don't want to miss out on the heals and boons provided to you from the other side of the boss. On bosses with actually huge hitboxes like Doom, you should have everyone stand inside the hitbox to be in boon range. Front and back of the boss are defined based on the center of the hitbox. So as the tank, all you need to pay attention to is not crossing the center point, because that will turn the boss. If you ever tried tanking the legendary enemies on Kadim, you should already be familiar with this concept, as there the tank needs to be close to the center of the hitbox to grab aggro due to proximity tanking. There is one place in raids where you could break this rule though. Remember what I said about high melee range and the bosses not moving? Well, there exists one boss where you might want to abuse that. On Canute, one of the Largus twins, if your group nicely hugs the hitbox from behind, as the tank you can kite the boon strip attack, which goes on the farthest person away from the boss. All you need to do is stay in max melee range of the boss. Keep in mind, however, that this won't be possible if your group gets knocked back by the shockwaves, has movement skills in their rotation, or doesn't stack closely enough. Rule 0. Don't die. To not die, you will need to understand boss attack patterns. What does each attack do? What are the consequences of face tanking it? Can you evade or block it? Can you out-heal it? Can you sidestep it? How often do these attacks happen? When learning how to tank a boss, these are all questions you will want to find answers to by watching specific boss guides, reading the wiki, or experimenting yourself. Not every attack will require blocking or out-healing, and this is what I want to focus on here. First, let's look at big animation locks. Some attacks will lock bosses in place, so you can freely move during that time. The most important example here is Deimos. During Mind Crash, he will be completely immobile, and that gives you enough time to walk into the shield in the middle and then walk back to the boss before he starts moving again. Why do this instead of just using a block of your own though? Mind Crash applies a taking damage debuff to those who block it themselves instead of standing inside the shield. That means you will be relieving a lot of damage pressure by going into the shield. And if you're scared it will mess up the oils, don't worry. Contrary to a common misconception, they do not go onto the second closest person to the boss, but rather onto the closest person to the boss excluding the tank. So your positioning has nothing to do with where they spawn. Other examples of obvious animation locks include the Flame Breath from the Hydra on Kadim, which gives you easily enough time to walk to the group, give them some boons, and reposition for tanking again. As well as Kadim the Peerless spawning the carpets, where you can do the same. Another example worth mentioning is Azira's Blurred Frenzy, as it's a bit of a special case of an animation lock. She won't move during the attack, but she will turn. That means you can dodge backwards and then forwards to avoid the damage, and she will stay where she is. But if you try to dodge it forwards towards the squad, she will turn around and murder everyone, so be careful. Now, there's also less obvious cases, and knowing these will change your life as the tank. On the Hydra, as well as the other legendary enemies in Kadim, you can actually sidestep every single auto attack by sitting close in the hitbox and moving just a little behind it or to the side as the animation starts. The same can be done on Soulless Horror, and mastering the movement of baiting the attack to the right, moving slightly to the left to sidestep, then baiting the next to the left, and moving slightly to the right will relieve so much damage pressure that you will never be scared of tanking this boss again. I have even tried tanking it on Quickness Herald in base 1000 toughness and managed to never downstate by using this technique, or survived with over 10 stacks of the debuff when the other tank died, to give you an idea how valuable this technique is. Finally, let me introduce an idea that was presented to me years ago which I found incredibly eye-opening. As the tank, it's up to you where the boss stands, and because the group should be hugging the boss hitbox from behind, it's also up to you where most of your squad will be. But why is this important? You might have noticed that on Solace Horror, with a beginner tank the fight is a huge struggle, and with an experienced tank it's suddenly really smooth. It might even seem like you get better walls with an experienced tank, but it's by no means some hidden mechanic you don't know about. The answer to this mystery is simple. An experienced tank will start moving the boss as soon as the wall appears. A lot of beginner tanks notice incoming walls really late, start moving late, the squad notices the boss movement late, and it all snowballs into not enough time to escape the wall. But while that is the most noticeable example, the idea goes even deeper. Take Doom, where you control the positions of the lesser deathmarks to a degree. How? They always go into a player, so if everyone is stuck behind the boss, and you determine where the boss is, you also determine where they will spawn. Of course, you can get unlucky and Doom can jump onto someone running off with a bomb, but that's only a 10% chance. Putting lesser deathmarks into good spots is important, because if you place two of them next to each other and then attempt to tank in between them, people won't have enough space to run away with shackles or with bombs. And this idea gets even more crazy. On Doom CM, you also control the echo to a degree, because it always bounces on the player, moving the boss a single step forward at the right time can actually make it much easier for everyone to avoid getting picked. If you watch the echo's path when you're about to move the boss and adjust your movement even a tiny little bit, it can already make a huge difference. What's more, even simply turning the boss to the side might make your squad reposition to stay behind it, which will be enough to avoid the echo, and you can turn it back to what it originally was when the echo bounces back in the same fashion. You don't control the squad positioning just by moving the boss, but also by turning the boss, and sometimes doing this will be more than enough for people to avoid taking damage or failing mechanics without even realizing it themselves. Now a little bit of the theory. How is the tank decided? Most raid bosses can be split into two main categories: toughness-based tanking and proximity-based tanking, although there are a few special cases as well. Here you can see the bosses that aggro on the person with the highest toughness, and bosses where tanking is decided by proximity. On Sabbathad it will be the closest target for some attacks and the furthest for others. Matthias and Kern will always focus the furthest. Samarok will fixate on the furthest person when the break bar is broken, while Katim, as well as his legendary enemies, will focus the closest. The tank is decided by picking up and or activating special action key on a Mo and SH. QTP is a bit of a special case where it's the first player to get close to him with special action activated, and Sloth doesn't fit into any of these categories because there the aggro is random. There is also a weird interaction on Deimos where Soul, the ad you find every 25%, aggroes on the highest precision, which is still not widely known enough, so I figured it might be worth mentioning. If you need toughness to get aggro of the boss or increase your survivability due to the high damage pressure of the fight, there are a few ways to adjust your gear depending on the role you're playing. If you're tanking on a healer, all you need to do is swap your harrier gear to either minstrel and or giver. You can check my druid guides to see what exact build I recommend to run on druid. For other classes, the main thing to keep in mind is that Minstrel gives you less concentration than Harrier or Giver, and depending on what build you're playing, you might need close to 100% boon duration to upkeep the relevant boons. However, in order to maximize your effective HP, you need a balance between vitality and toughness, which means that in most cases it is ideal to take more Minstrel pieces if you don't need the boon duration from Giver. If you're tanking on anything that isn't a healer, you can swap some gear to Celestial or Trailblazer, and in very desperate situations to Commander or Knight. If you need just a tiny bit of toughness to be above everyone else and don't need survivability, one toughness infusion should do the job. Tanking is a very important job and can be very difficult without proper guidance. I hope this guide answered some questions none of the boss-specific guides answer, and tanking will now seem less daunting to you. If you have any questions, drop by Discord or my stream, and I'll be happy to help.